This is the Todd Shapiro Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
All right. Like I said, Thanksgiving Thursday, and here taking time out of his day. I'm sure he's like right in it right now in fantasy football, watching football. Chris McConnell from the Roto Bros Fantasy Football Podcast. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, good to talk to you, Todd. How's it going?
Great, Chris. Yeah, definitely appreciate you being here. Are you currently watching a game?
Yeah. Actually, just got home not too long ago, so we got the Bills and Cowboys on. So enjoying that. Definitely enjoyed the Lions and the Bears earlier, so that was a fun one. But it's been a big day of and a lot of eating. So we had a cornhole tournament earlier, so we had a big day, a lot of stuff going on.
Hey, just for our Canadian listeners, and we do have a Thanksgiving up here. We celebrated a few weeks earlier than you guys, but Thanksgiving in the States is really it's if anything, it might even be bigger than Christmas from what I hear in terms of the travel and families getting ready and together and all that kind of stuff. How important of a day is it?
I'd say it's pretty important, especially here in the South, because it's like I said, it's all about good food, family, and football. So the 3 Fs. But yeah, it's definitely a big day. There's always a ton of travel. I'm sure that's how it is across the country as a whole. But I'd say Thanksgiving and Christmas not too far off as far as importance and how busy it is and how big of an event as a whole that they both are. But yeah, like I said, it's been a big day, and we've enjoyed ourselves, so we're stuffed, and so now it's time to watch the rest of the games. My Falcons play tonight, so that's going to be nice. So I'm going to sit back, watch the rest of the games, and I'm going to sleep good tonight with a full stomach.
Yeah, without a doubt. Turkey, for sure, too, will do that to you, won't it?
Absolutely.
So, Chris, okay, so let's talk about, daily fantasy sports, and obviously we do some stuff with drafters.com. I recognize how big it is. How long have you been doing this for?
I've been doing fantasy sports for probably, it's got to be 16 years now, 15, 16 years. Daily fantasy, I kind of jumped into that scene probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's kind of been, pedal to the metal since then. So it's been a blast. And of course, you mentioned Drafters, Andrew and Zach over there at Drafters. They're some awesome guys. They're actually some of our partners at FSA, Fantasy Sports Advice and Analysis, which is one of the biggest fantasy sports groups on Facebook that I run. And so it's definitely been a great partnership with them. We've had a blast. And, Drafters is a very, very fun, very new, DFS site, and it's a little bit different because, you got DraftKings. Everybody's heard of DraftKings and FanDuel, but Drafters has a different spin on it. There's no salary cap, so you're not, having to spend, certain amounts on certain, certain players and things of that nature. So Drafters has a different spin. It's just it's snake drafting, if you will. So anybody that's drafted in fantasy football before, they'll be familiar with that. And it's, like I said, it's a different spin. It's a lot of fun. And, man, I tell you what, those guys have just been so gracious, and they're so humble, and we get along with them so well. They're fantastic partners to have, and highly recommend Drafters to anybody. If you haven't checked it out, do yourself a favor and play on Drafters as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's great that you say that, and it's very kind and genuine of you, and getting to know you now, Chris, you are just a real good dude and stuff. I want to ask about the sort of the daily fantasy sports, and really what it comes down to is kind of betting at times, spending money, even though there's free games and everything, and people do that very cautiously and stuff. But is there ever a negative to the industry, or is it super positive, and is it more of a community than people might imagine?
I'd say the biggest positive is losing money. You spend, you go in, you spend $80, $90 one night on a few certain games, and you end up losing it all. But of course, the positive can be twofold. As you put $80, $90, in one night, and you win $400. So you almost triple your deposit there. So it's really nice to kind of get that back, of course. So that's why everybody plays. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say there's a whole lot of negative. Obviously, like I said, the biggest negative would be, not having a good night and losing money. But that happens to all of us, right? That happens to all of us. And, you keep playing, you get better. And, you check out the Roto Bros Fantasy Football podcast, of course, and you learn some things, and you start to win some money, and it just becomes one of your favorite hobbies. So daily fantasy is definitely. Fantasy sports as a whole has been around just decades, but daily fantasy is, in relation to season-long fantasy sports is relatively new. And so I think it's obviously still very, growing at a huge rate. And, you're seeing some states, legalizing, gambling now, and where DraftKings and FanDuel and Drafters and, all the other DFS sites, they're all, starting to be, more widespread, I guess legal, if you will, or I guess accepted in some circles in different states. So it's good to see that it's growing because it is a lot of fun. And I'm telling you, you really get into the industry. You meet a lot of people, as I have. You network with a lot of people, as I have. And they're just some of the best people you ever meet. And like I mentioned Andrew and Zach earlier from Drafters, and they're just an example. I've met so many people through fantasy sports, which, it sounds nerdy and it sounds silly, but it's just, what better way to meet a ton of people who all share the love and the passion of their favorite hobby. So to me, there's very little negative, much more positive from my 15, 16 years in the industry, and it's been a blast from the get go. So I couldn't be more thrilled to be a part of it.
Yeah, Chris McConnell, you said it well, and that's sort of what I mentioned about sort of the community. And listen, I've done obviously a deeper dive working with Zach and getting the word of Drafters out there because there really is a great supportive community, and it's kind of fun. There's actually playful chirps. People don't take it too seriously. And the one thing I caution people is obviously do things responsibly, and if you do gamble, you do it with the money you can afford to lose. But it's also entertainment. You got to admit, like and listen, I'm a guy who bets from time to time. I always bet within reason, and it's like going to a movie. It's at the end of the day, a movie's going to cost you $40 if you get 2 tickets, popcorn, and a Coke. And if that's money you can afford to go to a movie, well, it's amazing how invested you get into a game if you spend a $40, $30 bet or do a DFS or do a snake draft or do whatever it is, if you're cautious about it. And that's what I love about it, because it brings out a different emotion when you're watching, let's be honest.
It really does, because your favorite team could be playing, and then even the smallest, everything could be going swimmingly for you, and you could be, you could be plus $300, in your pocket, and all of a sudden, whatever quarterback you're playing throws one interception, or fumbles the ball one time, or gets sacked one time, and all of a sudden you're only plus 50 now, or you've lost it all, and it's really sort of almost a love-hate relationship, to be honest with you.
Yeah, without a doubt, but you're invested, you're involved, and you're studying, and that's one thing we learned about. You're always studying, you're always keeping up to date. So who are you loving right now as players? Who's great for a fantasy team?
Well, I'm telling you, this is something that I've been harping on for several weeks now on the Roto Bros Fantasy Football podcast with myself and Mark Wimpin. So if you guys, anybody listening is into fantasy sports, and even if you listen to podcasts or don't listen to podcasts, definitely check us out. We also have a dedicated DFS pod, Daily Fantasy Sports. We've got a dedicated mini podcast we like to call dedicated to that. So you definitely want to check that out if you want to learn more about daily fantasy as well. But a couple of the guys that I've really been kind of harping on to get everybody ready for the fantasy playoffs is three quarterbacks in particular. And number one has been Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold, obviously, quarterback for the Jets. He's been having a pretty rough season. And then, you look at his schedule, you do the research, and you see, okay, by the time I'm in the fantasy playoffs, or the weeks leading up to me trying to lock up a spot in the fantasy playoffs, he's got a really attractive schedule for, going up against teams that are very, very susceptible to giving up fantasy points to quarterbacks. And you're seeing that this weekend. This weekend he's playing the Cincinnati Bengals. That's another team that has had a lot of issues in the secondary. So that should actually be a pretty good game from a fantasy standpoint for the Bengals. Andy Dalton is coming back this week, so you would think that the Bengals will be a little more competitive. So you're thinking, maybe if it's more competitive, perhaps two teams that don't have great defenses, a more competitive game that typically equals a lot of fantasy points. Sam Darnold could be on the positive side of that. And he's got a great schedule the next several weeks as well. So on the podcast several weeks ago, when they played New England, I was telling people, look, don't play him this week because he's playing that elite Patriots defense. But go ahead and pick him up in a week where everybody's ignoring him and stash him for the fantasy playoffs. So if you've got a guy like Aaron Rodgers, or a guy like Josh Allen, who you're not crazy about their fantasy playoff schedule, you can pick up a guy like Sam Darnold and you can love that schedule and you can feel pretty good about how they're going to play during the fantasy playoffs. And you've seen the last 3 or 4 weeks now, he's been lighting it up from a fantasy standpoint. Daniel Jones, the quarterback for the Giants, is another one. He's got an attractive schedule, and he's also got a higher floor when it comes to fantasy points because he has the ability to run and be a threat in the running game as well. And then finally, Carson Wentz. It's actually pretty ironic with Carson Wentz, the quarterback for the Eagles. He has had a lot of injuries lately at the receiver position, and typically for the most of the season so far, his receivers have had trouble dropping passes. But for the last couple of weeks, they've been dealing with some injuries. He's getting his weapons back, and he has an attractive playoff schedule as well. It starts this week against the Miami Dolphins. And as soon as you say the Miami Dolphins, you've got an attractive matchup. So Sam Darnold, Daniel Jones, Carson Wentz are my top 3 buy low quarterbacks, if you can buy them low, for the fantasy playoffs. Try to lock in a fantasy playoff spot. Those 3 guys are going to be very, very surprising plays and get you a lot of fantasy points, and I don't think you're going to be disappointed with any of them.
Chris McConnell is with us at Mind of McConnell. Give him a follow. When it comes to fantasy sports, does anyone have any players on the Bengals on their teams?
I think really obviously typically it's usually A.J. Green, right, is the player that everybody wants on fantasy. The problem is A.J. Green hasn't been healthy all year long, and he's still not healthy right now. So you're probably good to drop him if you have him on your team. But if there's one guy you want to own, it's obviously Joe Mixon. He's going to be the main player there. But with Andy Dalton coming back this week, he got benched a few weeks ago for Ryan Finley. Ryan Finley pretty much stunk up the joint. So Andy Dalton's back in the fold as the Bengals try to win a couple games and avoid the NFL draft basement, if you will. So I think what you're going to see is you're going to see Tyler Boyd start to ascend a little bit. And Tyler Boyd in PPR leagues has had a really high floor because he catches a lot of passes. And he's one of their most reliable targets, especially with A.J. Green not seeing the field. So Joe Mixon, Tyler Boyd are definitely the 2 Bengals that you can rely on, if any. But I understand if people didn't want to, they kind of want to go a different direction other than the Cincinnati Bengals. But again, with Dalton coming back, they're going to be a little bit more competitive. So that typically is going to lend credence to the offense scoring a little bit more fantasy points.
A little bit more. Just a little bit.
For what it's worth.
I'm much more of a snake 'em and rank 'em to a snake draft and rank 'em kind of play, which is why I love the drafters. And I think I mentioned this last time, I'm a little busier, so it's easier for me. One thing I've never asked someone who understands daily fantasy sports so much like you would, quite frankly, how does it work for rookies at, say, the start of the season? Do people take gambles on the rookies before they've even proven themselves?
I think, you typically do, yeah, because you usually want to have at least 1 or 2 players that you draft on your team that have low ownership, that may have a good spot to quote smash. Smash is a term that you'll hear in the daily fantasy community a lot. But and of course that means you blow up, you have a great game. Rookies will have that sort of impact, but sometimes you want to be very, very careful with that because again, the NFL is a different game than college. It's so much faster. It's so much more physical. It's so much more complex, and it's just harder for a lot of players to wrap their minds around and to learn the complex NFL playbooks. So a lot of times it takes several weeks for these rookies to kind of get in the groove a little bit. Obviously, there'll be guys. Saquon Barkley last year had no problem adjusting to the NFL. Baker Mayfield, as soon as he came in onto the scene, he had no problem adjusting to the NFL. So you'll see sometimes where rookies, especially, highly drafted rookies, they were drafted highly for a reason, because their teams needed them. And why did their teams need them? Because they're not very good. So especially when it comes to quarterbacks and receivers, they're typically getting drafted onto bad football teams. And so it can sort of take a little bit of time for coaches to kind of get the scheme in place, get everybody to learn the playbook, and get everybody on the right track. And so for rookies, obviously, it takes a little bit longer. So in my opinion, the way I play, I would steer clear of the rookies for the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season before you start kind of trusting them. You want to see who is sort of whose learning curve, I guess. It's the best way to put it. Whose learning curve is sort of smaller than everybody else's. That way, you can kind of go out and kind of pluck out the ones that don't have as big of a learning curve and have, of course, matchups. Matchups is a huge thing as well. So you have a rookie receiver, for instance, playing against 3 or 4 bad secondaries in a row. They may have low ownership because obviously people are going to be wary that they're going to perform in their rookie seasons. But at the same time, you got to make sure that the system fits the rookie as well, and that they're set up for success. So if you got a rookie wide receiver and they're playing with a rookie quarterback, it's usually not going to be a good idea to go out and draft that rookie in daily fantasy, because you don't want your money on the line with guys that you just can't rely on.
No, without a doubt. And Chris McConnell's with us. I hate to keep sort of dropping drafters in here because I know there are other sites, and that's fair, and a lot of people use them. But drafters.com kind of has that ability if someone goes down that they sort of they substitute them. You kind of have your top 3 picks, and then they'll just make sure that they get in your team. Is that one of the other things too that people are very cautious of? Kind of trying, as sad as this is to say, because you never want to see someone get injured, or you never want to see any player go down and get hurt. But do you sort of try to predict players that actually might get hurt or traditionally do within a season to maybe avoid them?
I usually don't really do that because you really can't predict injuries, because at the end of the day, there's been players that are more susceptible to injuries, it seems. They just sort of have worse luck. But at the end of the day, they're all human, right? Nobody's Superman. And so just because one guy got injured 3 times, the previous year, and another guy didn't get injured at all the previous year, doesn't mean that in year 2 it's going to be the exact same story. When it all comes down to it, everybody's injury prone, right? So anybody can get injured at any moment. So I really don't like to try to predict injuries. But if they're already injured, and if there's certain injuries you want to look for, if they're dealing with something like turf toe or a hamstring injury, if they're a guy that has a ton of speed, especially, and they're dealing with a hamstring injury, those speedy receivers like John Ross, Tyreek Hill, Deshaun Jackson, those are guys that their main trait is their speed. And so when they're relying so heavily on their speed, they are typically more susceptible to pulling a hamstring or re-injuring a hamstring if they're already dealing with one. So hamstrings are one of those lingering injuries, turf toe, as I mentioned, as well. So there's certain injuries that you definitely want to kind of take a more cautious approach with. But for the most part, if a guy is coming off an injury and they're declared 100%, they're usually pretty safe to finish the game and continue on. But for the most part, if they have any sort of questionable designation, obviously a doubtful designation, you probably want to steer clear of those guys, unless, of course, you can get to your lineup very, very quickly, grab your phone, grab your computer, jump on, and make that change as soon as they are declared out of the game or out that night. And you see that way with NBA fantasy as well, because it's even more. It's every single day, not just every weekend. So with NBA fantasy, MLB fantasy, you definitely have to stay on top of the injuries. So you want to be checking Twitter, you want to be checking places like Roto World and stay on top of that. And it can really be pretty busy. It can get you pretty busy, and so you really got to have access to all that information. And if you're not somebody that has all that access, it's probably best to steer clear of guys that are injured or have been injured, and you're not really sure if they're going to end up playing or not.
My goodness, Chris, you really know your stuff, man. No wonder why you're very successful at what you do. We love having you on the program. Chris McConnell, can you tell everyone the various places where they can find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter, obviously, at Mind of McConnell. You can also find me on Facebook. I help run the largest, most active fantasy sports community on the planet. You're not going to find a bigger, more active fantasy sports community anywhere. You can go to Facebook and type in FSA Fantasy Sports Advice and Analysis, and you'll find us. Go ahead and join the group today. I'll accept your request personally, and you definitely will not regret it. It's a great place. 365 days a year, we cover all sports. You're gonna have a lot of knowledge, a lot of good information, and up-to-date injury news as well. So we just mentioned injuries. It's a great way to stay on top of injuries as well. And then, of course, you can find me on all of the podcast streaming websites. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find the Roto Bros Fantasy Football Podcast with myself and my co-host, Mark Wimpkin. We have a blast. It is definitely a podcast that is different from all other fantasy podcasts. The audio quality is second to none. And I think a lot of times, when you listen to different sports podcasts, the guys sound like they're talking into a tin can. This is high quality audio, high quality information. And Mark and I really view the game from two different spectrums. And so that makes for a lot of disagreement. It makes for a lot of great content and a lot of great, debate and discussion and deliberation. So everybody will definitely have a blast with that. And I'm sure it'll be your favorite fantasy sports podcast. So check out the Roto Bros on all major streaming platforms. And like I said, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Chris, thank you so much for your time, man. As we're talking, I think the Bills just took the lead, and who would have ever thought that the Bills would have such a great record and at this point of the year? And the team is playing great. And being in Toronto, the Bills are kind of the team we really root for the most. So go Bills against the Cowboys on Thanksgiving Thursday. Thanks, Chris McConnell. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Happy Thanksgiving to you guys as well, even though it was a few weeks ago. And hey, go Bills.
All right. Cheers, my man.
This is the Todd Shapiro Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.